Hello, this is my fifth and final video on dating the Torah. Let me share my screen. Okay, dating the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, part 5. It's time that we talk about Genesis because Genesis is different from the other books. Genesis was a book in which Moses was not an eyewitness and not even that very close in years. Genesis is really different from the rest of the Old Testament, and we need to consider that first, I think. There are a lot of ways where it's just completely different from the rest of the Old Testament. I'll list some of them. For one thing, Abraham married Sarah, who is his half-sister. Now, this would be considered incest, and it was against the law, and so it's sort of an unthinkable thing, but Abraham and Sarah are not condemned by God or man. In fact, they are uniquely blessed. What happened was this marriage took place before the law was given. Or how to swear. There's a lot of times in the Old Testament that people take an oath, and what they usually do is they say, as the Lord lives, or sometimes they say, as your soul lives. But in Genesis, that's not how you swear. In Genesis, it's put your hand under my thigh and swear. That shows up 3 times. Or there's the importance of household idols. In Genesis 31, there's the story of Jacob and his family running away really from his uncle Laban, and Rachel, Jacob's wife, steals the household idols. It isn't quite so clear why that's important, but it made Laban especially angry about that more than anything else. And Jacob took it so seriously that, not knowing that Rachel stole them, he pronounced a death sentence on anybody who had stolen the idols. So that was really important. But the reason why is not entirely clear. I've heard some people speculate that it might be an indication that you're going to be the heir or something like that, but we don't really know for sure. Or how about this? There was this custom in Genesis of a wife giving her husband her maidservant with the understanding that the children would be the first wife's. Now, amazingly, that never actually seemed to work out very well, but it was not done just one time. It was done with Sarah and Hagar, and then later Rachel and her maidservant Bilhah, and then Leah and Zilpah. So they did it 3 different times. This was something that in Israel was never done, never even considered. However, it is supported by the Code of Hammurabi, a very ancient law code, laws 144 to 166. And the Code of Hammurabi dates to probably around 1800 BC and wouldn't be that far from the area where Abraham and Sarah were originally born. We're all familiar with the binding or almost the sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22. And our familiarity may lead us to neglect the thought of how unthinkable this was. In later Israel, you would never even consider doing this. It's against so many laws, but yet it is a story that happened in Genesis. And the whole world is different. You know, the lifespans in Genesis range from 127 to 969 years for the people who died of old age. The longest lifespans were all before the flood, and then they began to decrease. But even by the end of Genesis, people were still living far past 100 years old. Or here's a little small detail that was always interesting to me. Abraham and Lot decided that they needed to separate, and Abraham gave Lot the choice of which land would you like to choose to live in. And Lot looked around and chose the best land. He chose the best spot. It was the Jordan Valley near Sodom, which was described as being well watered everywhere. Okay, so here's a geographic satellite map of the land of Israel taken in 2003, but there's no reason to think that during the time of the kings or so that it was any much different from this. Other biblical evidence seems to support it is, but Lot chose the brown area where the arrow points. He chose the area which if you look at a modern map, would be the absolute worst area. And at the time, he thought it was the best. But maybe in the time of Genesis, it really was. Now, the language of the patriarchs would have been different too. It was likely not Hebrew. I've been a little surprised. I have found hardly any scholars try to tackle this subject, but I think we can say with pretty high confidence that they were not likely speaking Hebrew as their first language. For one thing, all the scholars do agree that Hebrew is a Canaanite language. It is not the language which would have been spoken in the place where Abraham and Sarah were born, in Ur of the Chaldeans or in Haran, which are really quite far from Canaan. Abraham and Sarah were born in Ur of the Chaldeans. And while they had a son, Isaac, who would have been born in the land of Canaan, Abraham and Sarah, if they learned to speak the local language, they were speaking Canaanite/Hebrew as a second language. And Isaac, their son, might have been a little bit more natural a speaker of the local language, but he marries Rebekah, who was from Haran. And then when their son Jacob gets married, it's to Rachel and Leah, who are also from Haran. So all of the matriarchs in Genesis, all of the women, none of them were native Hebrew speakers. Likely the language that they were speaking was some early form of Aramaic, which is in the same language family as Hebrew, and it has a lot of similarities, but it wouldn't have been Hebrew. When did they make the switch? Well, I think there's a good clue in Genesis 31:47. This is again where Jacob is running away from Laban, and Laban catches him, and they argue, and they finally agree to separate, and they set up a pillar there, and Laban gives it a name. And the name that he gives it there is an Aramaic name. And Jacob gives it a name, and the name that Jacob gives it is a Hebrew name. And it's almost symbolic of Jacob saying, I've had it with the old country. We are never going back again. Now, the phrase generations, these are the generations of. This is a phrase which is common, and it's the origin of the word Genesis. It's where the book gets its name, because this phrase, these are the generations of, occurs 10 different times in the book of Genesis. Sometimes it's connected to genealogies, but sometimes it is not connected to genealogies. It may indicate that there was a written record that belonged to or was written by the person named in the phrase. There's a lot of theories about that, and things have been written. You can Google something like the tablet theory or toledot, which is the Hebrew word for generations, to read more about that. It is outside the scope of what I want to cover in this series, but those are all ideas that support the idea that it might have been in some form or another a written record. Now, the last one that's mentioned is in Genesis 37:2. After that, you have the story of Joseph, and Joseph goes to Egypt. So this generations thing seems to mostly apply to what goes before the story of Joseph. And here's a written table of the Toledot being the word, these are the generations of different people. So overall, for the Torah, I believe we can say that Moses was the author of the Torah, but for writing Genesis, he had to rely on previous, earlier written records. And what he had before him when he wrote Genesis was probably more than what made it into Genesis. In other words, there's a few hints of other things, like in Genesis 48:22, Jacob is talking and he recounts fighting the Amorites, but there's nothing previously in the book about that. And also in 49:31, he recalls the death and burial of Rebekah and Leah, Rebekah his mother and Leah his wife, but those are also not stories that are told in Genesis. And finally, as far as Genesis is concerned, I wanted to leave you with a couple pictures. This is the Tepe Gawra seal. And the date there, 3500 BC, I'll tell you, I'm suspicious about most any date that's before 1000 BC, because I'm not sure we can be confident of the high accuracy of it. But in any case, this is a very old seal, dated well before people would say the Torah was written, but it seems to depict a serpent behind a man and a woman. And the man and the woman are not standing tall, they are bending over as if they need to leave. So it could be a reflection of the Garden of Eden story. Here's another one. This is a drawing of a Babylonian seal. The original seal is in the British Museum, but this is a drawing of it. You know, you can't take a picture of things in the museum. And it seems to show a serpent, a man and a woman, and a tree with some fruit. The seal is dated to about 2000 BC, so it's also very old. Now, other people might say it is not exactly a representation of the Garden of Eden either, because in particular, the figure on the right appears to have horns, which might indicate that that figure is a god rather than a man. And yet, that doesn't necessarily invalidate the idea that the whole idea might have come from Genesis, because, you know, by the time the Babylonians got a hold of the story, there's no telling how it could have sort of been warped. But just the motif of the serpent with two people and a tree and fruit is kind of telling. Also, one thing I'd point out about this seal and the previous one is that in both images, the serpent is standing up rather than being on the ground. So overall, I believe that Moses is the author of the Torah. He was an eyewitness or near to an eyewitness from Exodus 2 through Deuteronomy 33. For the book of Genesis, he used previous material. Deuteronomy 34 is different. It would be an epilogue. It was Deuteronomy 34 is the last chapter in the Torah, and it describes Moses' death. So it would have been added a little bit after his life. And in my video on the scribes, I talked about this some. I believe that there were probably some scribal alterations to Genesis, to the Torah, and most of the earlier books to bring the Hebrew language up to date at the time that the scribes were copying it. So they would have done that for the language and also for some geographical references. So given that Moses is the author of the Torah, in order to date the books, what that leaves us with is it depends on the date of the Exodus. Unfortunately, that's not a very easy question, and people don't agree on the date of the Exodus. They generally are grouped into two camps, one for late camp in the 1200s BC range and one in an early camp in the 1400 BC range. I'm going to go with the early camp, and I'll explain why in a minute. But part of the reason that it's difficult is that the pharaohs are not named in the Torah. Now, later in the book of Kings, they are. There's two of them that get names, but in the Torah, Joseph in the book of Genesis stands before a pharaoh, but it just calls him Pharaoh. We don't know his name. And then in Exodus, we have the Pharaoh who rose up, who did not know Joseph, but we don't know his name. And we also don't know the name of the Pharaoh who was on the receiving end of all the plagues. It's sort of a charming thing that the Bible goes so far as to name the two midwives in Exodus 1, but it doesn't name the Pharaoh that they talked to. However, Ramses as a city is named in Exodus 1:11. And Ramses II was one of the more famous Egyptian pharaohs, and he reigned 1279 to 1213 BC. That's according to the conventional or normal Egyptian chronology, which is not universally accepted by everybody. And that's another subject that's a little bit more involved that I want to get into. But the idea, anyway, this is kind of supportive of a later Exodus date in the 1200s BC. Now, I wanted to show you this picture of this. This is called the Merneptah Stele. It's an archaeological discovery with all the hieroglyphics on the left, as you can see. And it was produced by Pharaoh Merneptah, who reigned 1213 to 1203 using the conventional Egyptian chronology. This is the first archaeological item that mentions Israel. And Israel is in their land when this takes place. the stele mentions Israel in a description of Merneptah's military campaigns in the region. So Exodus had to occur before this time. But to put an exact date on it, we have to, I think, try to plant our feet in something where the date is pretty solid. And the one thing that is pretty solid is the chronology of the kings of Judah and Israel is really pretty good. And when we go through the video on First and Second Kings, I'll explain why in more detail. But the reason is really because there's good cross references all around. It mentions a couple Egyptian pharaohs that we know about. It mentions Babylonian and Assyrian leaders that we also know about, and we can look up their history and see when they reigned. And in addition, you have two kingdoms in play, Judah and Israel. And for each one of them, the historian says that the king of Judah lived this many years, and he began his reign during this year of the Israelite king, and also the reverse. So there's all sorts of ways you can use to put a chronology together. And I don't want to imply that it was too simple to do this, but many people have done it. And at the end of the day, you can get a fairly reliable chronology of the kings of Judah and Israel. Unfortunately, when you go back before that time period, through the time period of the judges preceding the kings, it is not so solid. It's like all the lights go out at the same time, honestly. There's no comparison with Egypt or Babylon or Assyria that's of any use. And also the judges themselves didn't apparently rule over all of Israel, so their time frames might have overlapped. Some of them seem to only govern a few tribes in the north or in the south. And so that leads to difficulties trying to date events before kings. However, we do have this. We said that for the kings, we can be pretty confident about their date. And so in Solomon's reign, the fourth year of his reign would be 966 BC. And we have this one verse. It says, in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the fourth year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the second month, he began to build the house of the Lord. So 966, that's the time when this would have been set, plus 480 gives you 1446 BC as a date of the Exodus. Moses lived 40 years after the Exodus, so the date of the Torah would have been about 1406 BC. So that's my conclusion. That would be the date when Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy were written, 1406 BC. So thank you for watching, and I'll come out shortly with another video probably on the date of Joshua.